Hi, it's Miss Barrett. We're going to read a book together. It's an amazing story, and I'm super excited to share it with you. So, raise your hand if you think you know what it means to be loyal. Okay. Did you say that being loyal means to show constant support for someone or something? If you did, awesome. This story, Hachiko Waits, is about a loyal dog named Hachi, who was later given the name Hachiko. The story is fiction, but this dog, Hachiko, well, he was real, and he lived in Japan. Now, you guys probably know that most dogs are very loyal pets, but Hachiko's loyalty was something extraordinary. Chapter 1. When Professor Isaburo Ueno woke up, he liked to play a game with his golden brown puppy, Hachi. He lay on his futon, not moving a muscle. He did not even open his eyes. Could he fool Hachi into thinking he was asleep? Not a chance. Hachi knew the instant his master was awake, and told him so by pushing his cold, wet nose into the professor's hand. "Good morning, Hachi." The professor sat up and rubbed the soft patch of white fur that ran from the puppy's nose up between his eyes and stopped just below his pointy ears. "Did you sleep well, little friend?" Hachi answered by wagging his fluffy curled tail back and forth with great enthusiasm. "I'm glad you had such a fine night," the professor said as he put on his glasses and rose from his silk sleeping mat. "Now come along, Hachi. Let's start the day." He motioned to the puppy, who followed along as the professor washed himself, put on a dark blue kimono, and headed downstairs to eat the breakfast his housekeeper had prepared for him before she left for the marketplace. The professor entered the tatami room, walked across the straw mats covering the floor, and sat down on a cushion in front of a low wooden table. He poured himself a cup of hot green tea. As he lifted the steaming teacup, he looked up at a calendar hanging on the wall. The page it was turned to had a beautiful picture of a bright yellow sun rising over Japan. "April 1st, 1924, the professor read out loud. "It is going to be a good day, little friend." The professor said this every day. He was a man of habit. Professor Ueno began to eat his breakfast of miso soup, dried fish and seaweed, rice, cooked eggs, and pickled radishes. His housekeeper had also set out breakfast for Hachi, a bowl of rice with miso soup poured over it. Hachi went over to his bowl, sniffed at it once, and walked away. He sat in the doorway and gazed at his master with a pleading look in his dark brown eyes. The professor knew what Hachi wanted, but he shook his head. "No, Hachi, you cannot have yakitori for breakfast," he said. Yakitori was the puppy's favorite meal. "I will buy some for your supper tonight on my way home from the train station, and you can practice pulling the chicken off the skewers the way I taught you. Now eat your food." Hachi stayed where he was, and again the professor knew what he wanted. Hachi played this game with him every morning. He was a dog of habit. "All right, Hachi." Professor Ueno went over to the dog's bowl and knelt down beside it. Mmm. The professor smacked his lips as he pretended to pick a bit of the food out of the bowl and taste it. "What delicious rice this is, Hachi. Come and try a bite. Here." He scooped up a tiny bit of rice with his index finger and held it out to Hachi. The dog licked his finger and began to eat. "Did you enjoy your breakfast this morning?" the professor asked when Hachi was done. Hachi looked up at him with 2 grains of white rice stuck to his wet black nose. The professor laughed. "Let me wash your face, little friend. You cannot go around looking like that." He tenderly wiped the dog's muzzle with the corner of his napkin. "What a handsome dog you are." Hachi sat up straight and tall, basking in his master's praise. The professor finished his tea and rose from his cushion. "And now it's time for your lesson, Hachi. Come." Professor Ueno walked to the front entryway with Hachi at his heels. The genkan had a mat spread out along one wall, with several pairs of professor's shoes lined up neatly upon it. The professor stepped out of his house slippers and into a pair of gita, the wooden clogs that he wore outside. Then together he and Hachi walked out of the house, across the front porch, and into the yard. "Look, Hachi!" The professor pointed to a tree in the yard that was full of pink buds about to bloom. "Soon it'll be time for our cherry blossom party." He took a few deep breaths, filling his lungs with fresh spring air, and then turned to face his dog. "Let us begin. he said to the puppy. Hachi, sit. The professor gave the command in a serious tone of voice, and Hachi immediately sat. Good dog, said the professor. Hachi, down. Hachi lowered his body onto the ground, and again his master complimented him. What a good dog you are. The professor knelt down and rubbed the fur around Hachi's neck and shoulders. What a smart dog you are, Hachi. What a clever dog you are. Professor Ueno praised Hachi in a high-pitched voice, as though he were talking to a baby. We will try 2 more things. The professor stood up and lowered his voice. Hachi, heel. The Professor Ueno took a few steps around the garden, and Hachi followed him, keeping close to his left side. Good dog, Hachi. Sit. Hachi did as he was told. Now, Hachi. Speak, said the professor. Hachi stared at him silently and tilted his head to one side. Hachi, speak. The professor repeated the command, but Hachi remained silent. Wah, 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 Professor Ueno demonstrated for him, yipping like a young puppy. But Hachi did not respond. The professor changed his bark. Wah, 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 he repeated in the dark, growling voice of a large, angry dog. Hachi just looked at him. All right, the professor shook his head. It seems you have nothing to say today. And it's time for me to go teach my other students. Come inside. Professor Ueno changed into a suit and tie and gathered his books and papers together. Then he walked down the hallway to the genkan and put on a pair of leather shoes. He left the house, and Hachi followed him to the front gate. Hachi, sit, the professor said. What a good dog you are. He bent down until he was almost nose to nose with the puppy. What a fine dog you are, he said softly. Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan. He gave Hachi a few soft pats on the head, kissed the tip of his nose, and stood up. I will return at 3 o'clock. Farewell, little friend. The professor turned from Hachi and pulled open the latch. As he went to shut the gate, one of his books dropped to the ground, and when the professor bent to pick it up, his glasses slipped down his nose and some papers blew out of his arms. The wind blew them down the street, and he raced after them without closing the gate properly. Hachi nosed it open and ran to be with his master. Hachi, how did you get out? The professor asked. You must go home now. The professor pointed toward the gate and spoke in a stern voice, but Hachi did not move. The professor took a step toward the house, but Hachi did not follow. He sat down right where he was and stared at the professor. Professor Ueno sighed and looked at his watch. Hachi, I'm going to miss my train, he said. Hachi wagged his tail. The professor sighed again and shook his head. He never could stay mad at his puppy for long. All right, little friend, he said, giving in. Come on, heel. Overjoyed, Hachi spun round in a circle and then fell into step beside his master. All right, so pause right here. I want you to talk to your class for a minute. What are you thinking about Hachi and the professor so far? Talk about it for a few minutes. Welcome back. Chapter 2. Shibuya was filled with tiled roof houses, bordered by a river and surrounded by large fields. The professor and Hachi rounded a corner and made their way down a residential street lined with tall kiyaki trees, their branches covered with clusters of small yellow blossoms. As I walked along, the road grew wider, and a tall Shinto shrine with red wooden gates and a green roof came into view. Many people nodded good morning to the professor as he passed, and they admired Hachi, who pranced along beside his master, his pointed ears pitched forward and his curled tail held high. As the professor and Hachi neared the train station, the streets grew busier with people rushing along on foot and bicycle. Merchants in dark blue happy jackets scurried by, pulling large two-wheeled wooden carts stacked high with boxes. Hachi, sit, the professor said, as they stopped at a corner and waited for a green trolley to pass. Then they crossed the street to the stairway leading up to the train station. Hachi lifted his nose and sniffed the air all around the food stalls near the steps to the station. Each stall was decorated with brightly colored paper lanterns, and each sold different things to eat: noodles, tofu, egg, and fish boiled in broth, and yakitori. The vendors do not open until later in the day, the professor told Hachi. And you have already had your breakfast, little friend. Come. He hurried up the steps to the train station, and Hachi hurried beside him. Good morning, Professor Ueno. The professor turned around and saw the station master. dressed in a crisp black uniform, white gloves, and red-brimmed hat, bowing in respect. "Good morning, Mr. Yoshikawa." "What a fine-looking dog you have there," the station master said. Hachi sat down and puffed out his chest proudly, as though he understood Mr. Yoshikawa's compliment. "I do not know what to do with him," said the professor, reaching down to rest his hand at the back of Hachi's head. "He followed me here, and I was afraid I would miss my train if I took him back home." "Well, I'll watch him for you," Mr. Yoshikawa said with another bow. "I would be happy to do you the favor." "I could not ask you to do such a thing," said the professor. "Ah, but you did not ask," the station master pointed out. "I offered. I will keep him in my office." "It's too much trouble." No, it's no trouble at all," Mr. Yoshikawa insisted. "On the contrary, it would be an honor for me to do such a small thing for a man of your position." The professor nodded as he thought over the station master's offer. "Arigato, Mr. Yoshikawa," he said, bowing in thanks. "That is very kind of you. I will return at 3 o'clock. "We will be waiting for you," said Mr. Yoshikawa, bowing as well. "What's your dog's name?" "His name is Hachi." "Hachi? Why did you name him 8? 8 is my lucky number because the kanji for 8 is shaped like a fan held upside down, and it is wider at the bottom than at the top," the professor explained, using his finger to draw the shape of the Japanese character in the air. "That means that the future is wide open, and Hachi is the 8th dog I have owned, so he is sure to be lucky. He's smarter than any other dog I have trained. Already I have taught him to sit, to lie down, to come, and to heel. The only thing I cannot teach him to do is bark." Perhaps it is better that he does not speak," remarked the station master. "Some dogs cannot be taught to stop barking." "Oh, that's true," said the professor. "But Akitas do not misbehave like that. They do not bark unless they think something's wrong. But I would still like to teach him, just to hear the sound of his voice." He looked down at his puppy, but Hachi remained silent. "Oh, well," Professor Ueno said, "I am sure Hachi will speak to me when he has something important to say. Thank you again for offering to watch him." The professor bowed to the station master. "He will listen to you. He is usually," he looked down at his puppy once more, "a very good dog." The professor showed the ticket taker his train pass and walked with Hachi and the station master onto the platform that bordered the train tracks and was sheltered by a red roof. The platform was crowded with commuters and shoppers. Many of the men wore business suits and leather shoes, as the professor did, but some of the men and most of the women wore kimonos with wooden gita clogs or straw zori sandals on their feet. While the station master patrolled the platform, Professor Ueno stood beside a woman in a green cotton kimono patterned with butterflies and fastened at her waist with an obi the color of pale jay. Her belongings were all tied up in a green cloth furoshiki. Sorry, guys. She balanced the tiny bundle on her right palm. With her other hand, she smoothed her son's small sailor suit. When at last the woman was satisfied with the boy's school uniform, she brushed away some wisps of hair from his forehead with her fingertips. "Look, Oka-san," the boy broke from his mother's fussing and pointed. "A dog is waiting for the train!" He held his hand out toward Hachi, but his mother pulled it back. "Yasuo, be careful. He might bite." "He will not hurt you." The professor knelt down between the boy and Hachi. "He's very gentle." "What's his name?" asked the boy. "His name is Hachi," answered the professor as he stood up, "and I am Isaburo Ueno." "I am Mrs. Takahashi," said Yasuo's mother, bowing her head, "and this is Yasuo, my son." Yasuo is very curious. As if to prove his mother's point, Yasuo bowed and immediately posed another question. "What kind of dog is Hachi?" he asked the professor. "Yasuo," Mrs. Takahashi said, "do not be such a bother." "It is no bother," said the professor. "I'm happy to answer your question. Hachi is a very special dog called an Akita Ken," he said proudly. And then, being a professor, he could not stop himself from giving Yasuo and his mother a short lesson about the breed. Akitas are known for their intelligence, loyalty, and extreme devotion. Many years ago, when Akitas were first bred in the northern mountains of Honshu, only members of the imperial family were permitted to own them. The breed is more than 300 years old. And how old is Hachi? Yasuo asked. Oh, he's just a puppy. He's only 6 months old. Well, I am much older than that, Yasuo boasted. He opened his hand, spread his fingers wide, and counted. Ichi? He pulled his thumb into his palm. Ni? He folded down his index finger. San, shi, go. Yasuo bent in the rest of his fingers and held up a closed fist with pride. I am 5 years old, he said, almost 6, and today is my first day of school. I'm going to school too, said the professor. Yasuo looked at him in surprise. I thought grown-ups went to work, he said. Well, I work at a school, the professor explained. I am a teacher in the agricultural department of Tokyo Imperial University. When you are older, maybe you will be in my class. I would like that, said Yasuo. At exactly 9 o'clock, the train appeared around the bend of the tracks, squealed into the station on squeaky brakes, and came to a halt. As the commuters rushed onto the train, the station filled with the noise of dozens of pairs of wooden gita clogs clacking against the platform. The professor stood while everyone else hurried past him onto the train. Hachi, sit, he said. Hachi sat, and Professor Ueno bent down and looked into his dark brown eyes. What a good dog you are, the professor said once the station had quieted. What a fine dog you are, he repeated softly. Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan. He stroked Hachi's head, kissed the tip of his nose, and straightened up. I will return at 3 o'clock. The professor stepped inside the train just before it pulled away and waved to Hachi. Farewell, little friend. Hachi stayed right where he was on the platform, craning his neck to watch the departing train that held his master. And when he could no longer see it, he sat a few minutes more, just staring at the empty tracks. Mr. Yoshikawa came up behind him and scratched his ears. You're going to spend the day with me, Hachi, he said. Come. Mr. Yoshikawa took a few steps back toward his office, but Hachi remained where he was, staring off in the direction that the professor's train had gone. And then he stood up, turned, and trotted off toward the exit of the station. Hachi! Mr. Yoshikawa called, clapping his white gloves sharply. Come back! Hachi ignored him and continued on his way. Hachi! The station master cried. He hurried after the dog, but when Hachi saw he was being chased, he dashed through the station, down the steps, and out onto the street. Mr. Yoshikawa followed the dog down the stairs and tried to catch him, but he could not leave his post at the train station. In dismay, he watched as the tip of Hachi's tail disappeared around the corner. What was he going to tell the professor when he returned on the 3 o'clock train? All right, chapter 3. Professor Ueno packed up his books and left his classroom in a hurry. He was so distracted by thoughts of Hachi, he almost collided with a delivery boy on a bicycle who was balancing a round tray stacked high with lunchboxes and rice bowls above his shoulder. Excuse me. The professor lowered his head in apology as the delivery boy swerved out of his way. Hoping Hachi had not caused the station master any trouble, the professor hurried along to board the train that would take him from the university back to Shibuya Station. Mr. Yoshikawa looked up at the big round clock hanging from the ceiling at the center of the train station. It was almost 3 o'clock. Soon Professor Ueno would arrive, and the station master would have to tell him what happened. The professor had trusted him to take care of his dog, and he had not done his job. All day long he had asked people waiting for their trains if they had seen Hachi. He's a young golden-brown Akita-ken with a white patch of fur on his face. The station master said it over and over. Every hour or so, Mr. Yoshikawa went down to ask the food vendors if they had noticed Hachi sniffing around their booths in search of a snack. He bought a bowl of udon from a vendor and quickly gobbled down the wide noodles and then spent the better part of his noontime break searching the neighborhood for Hachi, but he had not been able to find him. At 5 minutes before 3 o'clock, Mr. Yoshikawa walked out onto the platform, pulled at the tip of his red-brimmed hat. He looked to his right, the direction from which the train would arrive. There was no sign of it yet. Mr. Yoshikawa turned and looked to his left. He blinked once and then shook his head and blinked again because he could not believe what he saw. A golden brown Akita-ken. The station master rushed over to the dog. Hachi? He asked. The dog thumped his tail once at the sound of his name. Where have you been? Mr. Yoshikawa asked, rubbing the dog's neck and shoulders. I've been worried about you. Hachi stared into his eyes, mute. Well, never mind, Mr. Yoshikawa said, giving Hachi a pat on the head. I'm very happy that you're here. And just as the words left his mouth, the train entered the station and ground to a halt. Professor Ueno was the first one to step off. "Hello, little friend," he called, his voice full of happiness. Hachi ran to his master, licked each of his fingers, and then spun in circles before him. Yasuo and his mother followed the professor off the train. "Look, Oka-san!" Yasuo laughed. "The professor's dog is making himself dizzy." "He is dizzy with joy," said Mrs. Takahashi with a smile. When Hachi stopped spinning, Yasuo called, "Here, Hachi!" and he held out his hand. The dog looked at the boy and wagged his tail, but he stayed by the side of his master. "Thank you so much for watching him," the professor said to the station master. "It was very kind of you to do me the favor." "You are very welcome," said Mr. Yoshikawa. "Was Hachi any trouble?" Professor Ueno asked. Mr. Yoshikawa looked at the dog and lifted his eyebrows. Hachi looked back at him with his mouth slightly open and his pink tongue hanging out, almost as though he were laughing. "I do not know if he was trouble," the station master said. "Hachi left the station a few minutes after your train pulled away from the platform. I tried to catch him, but he ran too fast. I asked many people and searched for him during my lunch hour, but I could not find him. And then, out of nowhere," Mr. Yoshikawa gestured toward the train station's entrance, "he returned just before 3 o'clock. It is as though he knew when you would arrive." The professor looked down at Hachi and beamed. "Dogs could not tell time. Or could they?" "That is most interesting," he said to the station master. "I'm sorry he caused you so much trouble." "Oh, there's no need to apologize," said Mr. Yoshikawa, "because the story has a happy ending." "I thank you again," said the professor, bowing his head, and then he turned to Hachi. "I always knew you were smart," he said. "Now I know you are even smarter than I thought. Little friend, you are the smartest dog in all of Japan." Chapter 4. From that day on, Hachi walked to the train station with Professor Ueno every morning and met his train every afternoon. The professor knew that Hachi ran home after his train left the station because his housekeeper told him so. Hachi kept himself very busy while the professor was at work. He cleaned his paws and chased his tail. He sniffed the wind and chewed on sticks. He often took long naps in the sun under the cherry tree in the yard, but he always woke up in time to return to the station to meet his master's train. The station master checked the time as soon as Hachi arrived. 5 minutes to 3, he would announce, looking at the big clock hanging from the station ceiling. "Hachi, you are always right on time. I could set that clock by you." A year passed, and the professor's routine did not change. He and Hachi walked to the train station in the spring when the cherry blossoms bloomed, and in the summer when the rains came. They walked to the train station in the autumn when the leaves changed color, and in the winter when the snow fell. The professor was always the last one to step onto the train before it left in the morning, and he was always the first one to step off the train after it arrived in the afternoon. And Hachi was always there to meet him. He was never a minute early and never a minute late. And as soon as he saw the professor, he always ran to his master, licked his fingers, and spun in joyful circles before him. One morning in early May, as the professor and Hachi were taking their morning walk to the train station, Professor Ueno stopped to admire the many-colored fish-shaped banners hanging from bamboo poles outside the houses they passed. "Hachi, sit. Look, little friend," the professor said, pointing. "Those flags look like a type of fish called carp, and they have been hung in honor of Tango no Siku, a special holiday that celebrates all the boys of Japan." Hachi's eyes followed the master's finger toward the waving banners. Here's the professor. Hachi. Up there, those are those carp flags he was talking about. "It is traditional to hang a special carp flag for each boy in the family," the professor told Hachi. "When I was young, a big red and white carp flag that looked exactly like that flew for me." He gestured toward an especially large banner rippling in the wind. "The carp is very strong and very brave, little friend. He must swim upstream against the current, and that takes great determination and perseverance. But once he does so, he knows he can overcome all of life's obstacles and difficulties. Every boy, including you, Hachi, must strive to be as strong and brave as the carp." Hachi sat completely still with his ears thrust forward, listening carefully to the professor, as he always did when receiving such lessons from his master. "Come, Hachi," It is time to catch my train. Heel! The professor started off again, and Hachi fell into step beside him. It was a mild spring day, yet by the time Professor Ueno and Hachi walked up the steps to the train station, the professor's face was covered with sweat. He removed his glasses and wiped his forehead with a clean white handkerchief. "Good morning, Professor," the station master greeted Professor Ueno with a bow. "Hello, Hachi." "Good morning, Mr. Yoshikawa." The professor lifted his handkerchief and wiped his brow again. "Are you not feeling well?" the station master asked, his voice full of concern. "Would you like a glass of water?" "No, thank you." "That is very kind of you, but I am fine," the professor said, putting his handkerchief into his pocket. He showed the ticket taker his pass and walked through the doorway. "Hachi!" Yasuo called. The professor and Hachi crossed over to the platform. "Happy Boys' Day, Yasuo," said the professor. "Thank you," said Yasuo. He ran his hands up and down the fur around Hachi's neck. "He has gotten so big. He stands almost 2 feet high now and weighs 100 pounds. That's a good size for a male Akita," said the professor, who never let an opportunity to teach go by. "Feel his coat here." He guided Yasuo's hands to Hachi's chest. "This fur is his undercoat. It's thicker and softer than the rest of his fur. Once the undercoat has come in, the Akita-ken is full grown." "I am still growing," said Yasuo. "I'm going to be very tall." "Taller than I am?" teased the professor, who was not tall at all. "I hope so," said Yasuo, standing up on his toes. "Yasuo!" said his mother in a scolding voice. "The professor is a man of respect. Do not be rude to him." But Professor Ueno only laughed. "I am sure you will rise to great heights," he said to the boy. The 9 o'clock train arrived right on schedule. As everyone clambered onto it, Professor Ueno leaned down to say goodbye to Hachi. "What a good dog you are." He repeated the same words every day. "What a fine dog you are. Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan." He patted Hachi's head, kissed the tip of his nose. "I will return at 3 o'clock, he reminded Hachi. "Farewell, little friend." The train pulled away, and the professor waved as he always did. Hachi stayed right where he was, watching the train as usual. But then he did something he had never done before. As the train picked up speed, Hachi chased out after it and let out a loud bark. "Wah, wah!" he called to Professor Ueno, and then again, "Wah, wah, wah, wah!" The professor leaned out of the train with a worried look on his face. Was Hachi all right? But when he saw the dog standing on the platform and wagging his tail, he grinned and waved. "Hachi, what a splendid voice you have," he called out proudly. "What a good dog you are. Farewell, little friend." The station master walked over to Hachi and squatted down before him. "What did you have to say to the professor today that was so important?" he asked the Akita-ken. But Hachi would not repeat himself. He merely turned and left for home. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, when the train pulled into Shibuya Station, Hachi sat in his usual spot by the tracks, his eyes focused on the first car's door. It slid open, and a woman in a blue and white kimono with a tiny baby strapped to her back stepped out. A man carrying a newspaper followed. 2 young girls in matching blue skirts with white blouses and red kerchiefs tied around their necks came next. Where was the professor? Hachi sat still as a statue, waiting. Finally, Yasuo and his mother stepped onto the platform. "Hachi!" Yasuo called. The dog barely looked at him. "Oka-san, where is the professor? He was not on the train." "Well, perhaps he was in another car," Mrs. Takahashi said, her eyes searching the platform. "I do not see him," she said. "Hachi, your master must have missed his train. Do not worry. I'm sure he will be on the next one." "Do not worry, Hachi," Yasuo repeated, patting the dog on the head. Hachi sat up very tall and straight, with his ears held erect, staring at the train tracks. When the next train arrived, he looked at each person who stepped out, but none of them was the professor. Other trains came and went, each one discharging many passengers. Some people hurried by Hachi. Others stopped and ran their hands along the dog's fur. Hachi paid no attention to any of them. Hachi waited all afternoon and all evening as train after train pulled in and out of the station. Mr. Yoshikawa brought him water and tried to share a bowl of rice with him, but Hachi would not eat. Finally it was midnight, and the last train arrived at the station. Professor Ueno was not on it. "Where can the professor be?" the station master wondered out loud. He took off his hat and scratched the side of his head. This is not like him. He never misses his train. The station master put his hat back on and pulled the brim down low over his eyes. "I'm sorry, Hachi. I have to close the station now, and you must go home. Go!" Mr. Yoshikawa pointed his white glove at the stairway. Hachi's eyes followed the station master's finger, but the rest of him did not move. "I'm sorry, Hachi, but you must go." Mr. Yoshikawa was kind yet firm as he forced Hachi through the station toward the exit. Hachi did not want to leave, but he had no choice. The station was locked up tight behind him. So, I wonder why the professor was not on his train. What do you guys think? Why do you think that? We'll find out tomorrow.